A scream tore through the Wyoming dawn like a knife through silk. Elias Cutter's hand froze on his coffee cup. He'd heard dying animals before, coyotes caught in traps, horses with broken legs. But this was different. This was human terror, raw and desperate, echoing across his frozen fence line. What he found there would shatter his solitary existence forever. A girl, 18 years old, bound like livestock and left to die by the man who should have protected her. This is their story. Stay until the end and comment your city below so I can see how far this tale travels. The mist hung low over the Wyoming hills that morning, thick as lamb's wool and twice as suffocating. Elias Cutter had been awake since 4, same as every morning for the past 12 years, watching the darkness leak away into that peculiar gray that came before true dawn. His cabin sat alone on 200 acres of scrubland and sage, far enough from Lark Hollow that he could pretend civilization didn't exist, close enough that he could ride into town when supplies ran low or loneliness ran high. Neither happened often anymore. He stood at his kitchen window, hands wrapped around a chipped mug that had seen better decades, watching steam curl up into the cold air of the room. The wood stove crackled behind him, the only sound besides his own breathing and the occasional creak of settling timber. This was his life now. Simple, quiet, deliberately empty of complications. Then came the scream. It started low, almost like the wind catching on a fence wire, then rose into something that made his coffee go cold in his mouth. Elias set the mug down hard, liquid sloshing over the rim, and grabbed his coat from the peg by the door. His rifle stood in the corner, always loaded, always ready, but he left it. Something in that sound told him weapons wouldn't help. He pushed through the door into air so cold it hurt to breathe. The scream came again, closer now, definitely human, definitely female, and definitely terrified. Elias broke into a run, boots crunching through frost-brittle grass, heading toward the eastern fence line where his property bordered the old access road. The mist swallowed him whole. He ran blind, guided by sound and instinct, one hand outstretched to avoid running headfirst into a fence post or tree. The screaming had stopped now, replaced by something worse, sobbing, broken, and hopeless, the sound of someone who'd given up on rescue. "Hello?" Elias called out, his voice rough from disuse. "Where are you?" The crying stuttered, stopped. Then a voice small and cracked. "Help me. Please, God. Help me." Elias pushed forward through the mist until shapes began to emerge. The dark line of his fence, the weathered post he'd set himself 7 years back, and slumped against the wire. A figure in a torn dress that might have been blue once, but was now mostly mud and blood. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. She was tied to the fence with baling wire, the kind used for hay, wrapped around her wrists and threaded through the chain link so she hung suspended, toes barely touching the ground. Her face was a mess of bruises, one eye swollen shut, lips split and bleeding. She couldn't have been more than 18, maybe younger, with dark hair matted with dirt and what looked like dried vomit down the front of her dress. "Don't," she whispered when he moved closer. "Don't hurt me. Please don't hurt me anymore. I'm not going to hurt you." Elias kept his voice low, the same tone he used with spooked horses. "I'm going to cut you down. That's all. Just cut you down and get you warm." He pulled his knife from his belt, a good blade kept sharp, and reached for the wire around her wrists. She flinched but didn't pull away. Couldn't, really, not the way she was bound. "Who did this?" he asked, working the blade under the wire. "Who the hell would do this to you?" "My father." Her voice was barely audible. "He was drunk. He's always drunk now, but tonight was different." The wire parted with a snap, and she collapsed forward. Elias caught her before she hit the ground, surprised by how light she was, like a bird with hollow bones. She didn't fight him, just hung in his arms like something already dead. "He said I was worthless," she continued, words spilling out in a rush now that someone was listening. "Said I was just like my mother, good for nothing but spending his money and breaking his things. He dragged me out here. I don't even know where here is. And he tied me up and he said..." She broke off, shaking so hard her teeth rattled. "He said maybe someone would come along and find a use for me, or maybe the cold would take care of the problem. Either way, he'd be done with me." Elias felt something cold and heavy settle in his chest. He'd known cruel men before. Hell, he'd been raised by one. But this was something else entirely. "What's your name?" he asked, shrugging out of his coat and wrapping it around her shoulders. "Rosalie. Rosalie Turner." "All right, Rosalie Turner. My name's Elias Cutter, and this is my land you're tied to. I'm going to take you inside, get you warm, get you fed, then we'll figure out what comes next. That sound okay to you?" She looked up at him with her one good eye, studying his face like she was trying to decide if he was another nightmare or possibly, impossibly, a way out. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you help me?" Elias looked down at her, this broken girl who'd been left like trash on his fence line, and felt something crack inside the careful walls he'd built around himself. "Because you're not livestock," he said quietly. "Not while I'm breathing." He lifted her easily, cradling her against his chest, and started back toward the cabin. She didn't say anything, just pressed her face against his shoulder and cried, deep, shuddering sobs that seemed to come from somewhere primal and old. The mist was burning off now as the sun climbed higher, revealing the landscape he knew by heart. Rolling hills covered in sage and scattered pine, rocky outcroppings that turned gold in the right light, and far in the distance, the jagged line of the Rockies cutting against the pale sky. It was beautiful country, harsh and honest, and Elias had never wanted to be anywhere else. But looking down at Rosalie, at the marks on her wrists where the wire had cut deep, he understood something he hadn't before. Beauty didn't mean safety. Not for everyone. The cabin came into view, small and solid, smoke still rising from the chimney. He'd built it himself when he first came here, after leaving behind a life he didn't talk about and didn't miss. It was nothing fancy, just 4 rooms and a porch that sagged a little on the north side. But it was his, paid for. No debts, no obligations, no one to answer to. Until now. Elias kicked the door open and carried Rosalie inside, setting her down gently in the chair closest to the wood stove. She hunched forward immediately, hands stretched toward the heat, and he noticed they were shaking badly. "Stay put," he said. "I'll get you something warm to drink." He moved to the stove, poured coffee from the pot into a clean mug, added 2 spoons of sugar from the tin on the counter. When he turned back, she was watching him with a wariness that made his heart hurt. "It's just coffee," he said, handing it to her. "Nothing in it but sugar. I don't keep whiskey in the house." "Why not?" "Personal reasons." She wrapped both hands around the mug, breathing in the steam. "My father keeps it everywhere. Under the sink, in the barn, in his truck. He says it helps him forget." "Forget what?" "My mother. She died when I was 10. Cancer. After she was gone, he just disappeared into the bottle. I've been taking care of the house, taking care of him, taking care of everything since I was 11 years old." Elias pulled out another chair and sat down facing her. "And he repaid you by leaving you to die." He didn't mean it. The words came automatically, practiced. He was just upset. He gets upset sometimes and does things he doesn't mean. "Bull." Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "A man gets upset. He yells. He breaks some furniture. He doesn't tie his daughter to a fence in freezing weather and leave her for dead. That's not upset. That's attempted murder." Rosalie stared into her coffee and said nothing. Outside, the sun had fully risen now, burning away the last of the mist and flooding the cabin with thin morning light. Elias stood and moved to the window, looking out over his land. Somewhere out there, Earl Turner was probably sleeping off his drunk, if he was even still alive. Part of Elias hoped he was. He had questions for Earl Turner, lots of them. "Are you hungry?" he asked, not turning around. I don't know. I can't remember when I last ate." "Then you're hungry." He went to the kitchen, which was really just one corner of the main room with a counter and some shelves, and started pulling things out. Eggs from the basket on the windowsill, bacon from the cold box, bread he'd bought in town 3 days ago. His hands moved automatically through familiar motions, lighting the other burner on the stove, laying strips of bacon in the cast-iron skillet, cracking eggs into a bowl. Behind him, he could hear Rosalie shifting in her chair, the creak of wood and the soft intake of breath that meant she was hurting badly. "There's a bathroom through that door," he said, pointing with the spatula. "Water's cold, but it's clean. There's soap and towels. You want to wash up, you go ahead." I don't want to be any trouble. You're not trouble. You're a person who needs help. Big difference. She stood slowly, like every movement hurt, and limped toward the bathroom. Elias heard the door close, heard water running in the pipes, and went back to cooking. The bacon popped and sizzled, filling the cabin with a smell that was probably the closest thing to comfort food he knew. When Rosalie emerged 15 minutes later, she looked marginally better. The dirt was gone from her face, her hair was wet and slicked back, and she'd wrapped one of his towels around her shoulders like a shawl. The bruises stood out starkly now against her clean skin, purple and black, concentrated around her eye and jaw. "Sit," Elias said, sliding a plate across the table. "Eat." She sat. She ate. Slowly at first, then faster, like she couldn't quite believe the food was real and would disappear if she didn't consume it quickly enough. Elias watched from his own chair, picking at his bacon, not really hungry anymore. "What happens now?" Rosalie asked finally, pushing her empty plate away. "Now you rest. You're safe here." "For how long?" That was the question, wasn't it? Elias looked at her, really looked at her, and saw someone who'd spent her whole life being temporary, being conditional, being one mistake away from abandonment. "Long as you need," he heard himself say. "You don't know me. You don't know anything about me." "I know enough." "What if my father comes back?" "Then I'll deal with your father." She studied him with that same careful wariness, like she was trying to figure out the catch, the hidden cost, the moment when he'd reveal himself to be just another monster wearing a kind face. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Why are you doing this?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, staring at his coffee cup, at the dark liquid inside that had gone cold while he wasn't paying attention. "How did you explain to someone that you'd spent the last 12 years running from yourself, building walls, choosing emptiness over connection because emptiness was safer? How did you explain that sometimes someone else's need was so profound it could crack through all that self-imposed isolation?" "I had a sister once," he said finally. "Mary. 3 years younger than me. When I was 19, I left home. Had my reasons. Our father was a mean drunk, made our lives hell. But I left. And I left her behind. Told myself she'd be fine, that she was smart enough to take care of herself." He paused, the old pain rising up sharp and fresh. 2 years later, I got a telegram. Mary was dead. Died in a house fire. She was 20 years old. And every day since I've wondered what would have happened if I'd taken her with me. If I'd protected her like I should have. Rosalie's good eye was wet. "I'm sorry. Don't be sorry for me. Be sorry for Mary. But here's the thing. I can't help Mary now. She's gone. But you're here, and you're alive, and I'll be damned if I'm going to fail again when I've got a chance to do something right." Silence filled the cabin, heavy and significant. "I'm not your sister," Rosalie said softly. "No, but you needed help, and I was here. That's enough." She looked down at her hands, at the angry red marks around her wrists. "What if I'm too broken to fix?" "Then you're broken. So what? Half the things in this cabin are broken. That chair's missing a rung, the stove door doesn't close right, the window in the bedroom won't open all the way. Doesn't mean they're not useful. Doesn't mean they don't belong." Rosalie laughed then, a small, startled sound. "You're comparing me to broken furniture." "I'm comparing you to everything else in the world that keeps working even after it's been damaged, which is pretty much everything that matters." She smiled, just a flicker, but it was there. The first real expression he'd seen on her face besides pain and fear. "I'm tired," she admitted. "I haven't slept in... I don't know how long." "Bedroom's through there." Elias pointed to another door. "Bed's made, sheets are clean. You sleep as long as you need." "Where will you sleep?" "I've got the couch. Don't worry about me." She stood, swaying slightly, and Elias resisted the urge to reach out and steady her. She needed to move on her own, needed to remember she could. "Elias?" she said at the doorway. "Yeah?" "Thank you for cutting me down, for bringing me inside, for..." She trailed off, searching for words. "For seeing me." "Go sleep, Rosalie." She disappeared into the bedroom and closed the door. Elias sat alone in his kitchen, listening to the creak of bed springs, the small sounds of someone settling into sleep. Outside, the day had fully arrived, bright and cold and indifferent to human suffering. He stood and started cleaning up the breakfast dishes, hands moving automatically while his mind wandered. What the hell had he just done? He'd lived alone for 12 years by choice, had built a life around solitude and silence, and now he'd invited chaos right through his front door in the form of a broken girl with nowhere else to go. But even as he thought it, Elias knew he wouldn't have done anything different. Couldn't have. Some things you didn't choose, some things chose you. He was drying the last plate when he heard a vehicle approaching. Elias went to the window and saw a truck coming up his long driveway, kicking up dust, moving too fast for a friendly visit. His jaw tightened. The truck skidded to a stop in front of the cabin and a man climbed out, 50s, heavy-set, with the broken vein nose of a dedicated alcoholic. Earl Turner. Had to be. He had Rosalie's dark hair and the same shape to his eyes, though his were bloodshot and mean. Elias stepped out onto the porch, letting the door close behind him. He didn't bring his rifle. Didn't need to. Not yet. "Help you?" he asked, voice neutral. Earl squinted at him, swaying slightly, still drunk or drunk again. "You got my daughter in there?" "Depends. You Earl Turner? Asked you a question, cowboy? You got my Rosalie?" "Found her tied to my fence this morning, half frozen, beat to hell. You know anything about that?" Earl's face flushed. "What I do with my own kin ain't your concern." "She's 18 years old. That makes her an adult, not property." "She's my daughter, and she's coming home with me." Elias descended the porch steps slowly, deliberately, until he was standing at the bottom looking up at Earl. Even from 5 feet away, he could smell the whiskey coming off the man in waves. "Your daughter's sleeping," Elias said quietly. "She's safe, she's warm, and she's not going anywhere until she decides she wants to." "The hell she's not!" Earl started toward the porch. "I'm her father." "You stopped being her father when you left her to die." Earl froze, something like shame flickering across his face before anger burned it away. "You don't know nothing about it. Don't know what I've been through, what that girl put me through. Don't care." "She tell you about her mother? About how I worked myself to the bone trying to save her? About how I went into debt paying medical bills, lost the farm, lost everything while that girl sat around doing nothing?" "She told me enough." "Then she told you how she drove her mother to an early grave with her selfishness, how she spent money we didn't have on clothes and nonsense, how she told me her mother died of cancer when she was 10, Elias interrupted, "and that she's been taking care of you ever since, cleaning your house, cooking your meals, watching you drink yourself stupid every night. She told me you blamed her for something she had no control over, and you've been punishing her for it ever since." Earl's face had gone purple. "You got no right. I got every right. This is my land, she's under my roof, and you're not taking her anywhere." For a moment, Elias thought Earl might actually take a swing at him. The man's fists clenched, his jaw working, everything about him coiled for violence. But something in Elias's stance, the way he stood balanced on the balls of his feet, ready but not aggressive, must have communicated that this wouldn't be an easy fight. Earl took a step back. "I could call the sheriff." "Go ahead. Tell him how you left your daughter tied to a fence in freezing weather. See how that conversation goes." "This ain't over." "Yeah," Elias said quietly. "It is." Earl Turner stood there a moment longer, caught between rage and resignation, then spat in the dirt at Elias's feet. "She's trash, always has been. You'll figure that out soon enough." He climbed back in his truck and roared away, fishtailing on the dirt road, leaving a cloud of dust and the lingering stink of alcohol and bitterness. Elias stood watching until the truck disappeared, then turned back to the cabin. Rosalie was standing in the doorway, still wrapped in his towel, her face pale. "You heard all that," he said. "Not a question." "Most of it." She looked small and lost. "He's going to come back." "Maybe. Probably. But I meant what I said. You're safe here." "For how long?" "Stop asking that question. Answer's the same every time." She smiled that sad, broken smile that was going to haunt him. "You don't know what you're taking on." "Neither do you." Elias climbed the porch steps. "But we'll figure it out. That's what people do." "We're not people. We're strangers." Everyone's a stranger till they're not. He moved past her into the cabin, and after a moment she followed. The door closed behind them, shutting out the cold and the dust and the lingering echo of Earl Turner's poison. Inside, the wood stove crackled and the morning light filtered through dusty windows, and two damaged people stood in the kitchen of a falling-down cabin, trying to figure out how to be less alone. It wasn't much, but it was a start. 3 days passed in a strange kind of suspended time. Rosalie slept most of the first day, waking only when Elias brought her soup or water, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. It had been fighting for longer than just one terrible night. On the second day, she emerged from the bedroom around noon, still wearing the torn dress because she had nothing else, and stood uncertainly in the doorway like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to be there. Elias was at the table, mending a bridle that had cracked at the bit ring. He looked up when he sensed her presence, nodded toward the stove where coffee sat keeping warm. "Help yourself," he said simply, then went back to his work. She poured coffee with shaking hands, added sugar, sat down at the far end of the table. They stayed like that for almost an hour, not speaking, just existing in the same space while wind rattled the windows and clouds gathered dark over the hills. Finally, Rosalie said, "I should probably leave soon." Elias didn't look up from his work. "Where would you go?" "I don't know. Somewhere?" "Somewhere's not a place. Neither is here. Not for me." Now he did look up, his pale blue eyes steady on her face. "Why not?" "Because this is your home, your life. I'm just someone who happened to cross your path. Can't be expected to—" "I don't do things because they're expected," Elias interrupted quietly. "I do them because they're right. And right now, the right thing is you staying put until you're healed up and we figure out a real plan. Not you running off to somewhere with no money, no clothes, and a father who might decide to come finish what he started." Rosalie stared into her coffee. "He won't come back. He never follows through on anything. Except tying you to a fence." She flinched, and Elias immediately regretted the harsh words. But they were true, and she needed to hear true things right now, not comfortable lies. "Look," he said, setting down the bridle. "I'm not saying you have to stay forever. I'm saying you need time to figure out what comes next. You need to heal, you need to think, and you can't do any of that if you're running scared with nowhere to go." "What do I do in the meantime?" "Whatever you want. Sleep, read, there's books on that shelf. Help around here if it makes you feel better about staying, but you don't have to. You're not a servant, you're not paying rent, you're just here." She looked at him for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. "You're a strange man," Elias cut her. "Been called worse." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I'll stay, for a little while, until I figure things out." "Good." He went back to his bridle and she went back to her coffee, and outside the clouds opened up and rain began to fall in gray sheets that turned the world to water and mist. By the third day, Rosalie had started to move more freely around the cabin. The swelling around her eye had gone down enough that she could open it partially, and the cuts on her wrists were scabbing over. Elias had given her one of his old shirts and a pair of work pants that she had to roll up at the ankles, and she wore them like armor, like borrowed courage. She was washing dishes when Elias came in from checking the fence line, his coat dripping water onto the floor. "Storm's getting worse," he said, hanging the coat on its peg. "Creek's rising fast, might flood the lower pasture if this keeps up." "Will the animals be all right?" "Don't have any animals except the 2 horses in the barn, and they're high and dry. Used to run cattle here, but I sold them off a few years back. Too much work for one person." Rosalie dried a plate carefully. "You've been alone here a long time." 12 years. "Don't you get lonely?" Elias poured himself coffee, leaned against the counter. "Sometimes, but loneliness is better than the alternative." "What's the alternative?" "Depending on people who let you down." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Not everyone lets you down." "No, but enough do that it's easier not to risk it." "That's sad." "That's practical." Rosalie turned to face him fully, her hand still holding the dish towel. "You took me in. You risked it with me." "That's different." "How?" Elias struggled to put it into words. "How did you explain that helping someone in crisis wasn't the same as letting them into your life?" That you could offer shelter without offering vulnerability? That keeping someone alive wasn't the same as keeping them close? It just is, he said finally, knowing it was inadequate. Rosalie studied him with those dark eyes that saw too much. You're afraid. I'm cautious. You're afraid that if you let anyone too close, they'll hurt you the way someone hurt you before. So you live out here alone and tell yourself it's a choice when really it's a cage you built yourself. The words hit like a physical blow. Elias set his coffee down harder than he meant to. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? I spent 8 years in a cage made of my father's grief and anger. I know what it looks like when someone's trapped, even if the door isn't locked. This conversation's over. Why? Because I'm right? Because it's none of your damn business. He regretted the words immediately, saw her face close up, saw her shoulders hunch like she was expecting a blow. She turned back to the dishes without another word, and Elias felt like the worst kind of fool. Rosalie, it's fine. You're right. It's not my business. That's not what I meant. Isn't it? Elias ran a hand through his wet hair, frustrated with himself, with her, with the whole situation. I'm not good at this. At what? Talking, people, any of it. I came out here because I wanted to be alone, and I've been alone so long I forgot how to be anything else. She was still facing away from him, but her shoulders had relaxed slightly. Then maybe it's time you remembered. Maybe it is, he admitted quietly. But I'm going to be bad at it. Fair warning. Now she did turn around, and there was something almost like understanding in her expression. I'm pretty bad at it too, at trusting people, at believing they might actually want to help without expecting something in return. I don't expect anything. I know. That's why it's so hard to believe. They stood there in the small kitchen while rain hammered the roof and wind howled around the corners of the cabin, two broken people trying to figure out how to be less broken together. The storm lasted 2 more days. Elias spent most of that time doing indoor work, repairing tack, organizing his tools, reading through his ledgers even though there wasn't much to ledger anymore. Rosalie cleaned the cabin with a thoroughness that spoke of years of practice, and when she finished cleaning, she cooked. Simple things at first, eggs, bacon, bread toasted on the stove, but then more complex meals from ingredients she found in his sparse pantry. On the 5th day, the rain stopped. The sun came out weak and watery, and Elias decided it was time to ride into Lark Hollow for supplies. They'd eaten through most of his stores, and there were things Rosalie needed that he couldn't provide. Women's clothes, proper medicine for her wounds, other necessities he was too embarrassed to think about too closely. He was saddling his horse when Rosalie appeared in the barn doorway. I want to come with you, she said. Elias paused, his hands on the cinch strap. Not a good idea. Why not? Because it's a small town. People talk. They see you with me, looking like you've been through hell. They're going to have questions. Let them ask. You don't understand what you're asking. Lark Hollow isn't friendly to strangers, especially not women with no clear story about where they came from or why they're here. Rosalie stepped into the barn, her chin lifted in that stubborn way he was starting to recognize. I can't hide in your cabin forever. You're not hiding. You're healing. I'm hiding, and I'm tired of it. I've been hiding from my father's anger, from the town's pity, from everything hard in my life for as long as I can remember. I want to stop hiding. Elias studied her face, saw the determination there mixed with fear. She was terrified, he realized, but she was doing it anyway. All right, he said finally, but we do this my way. You stay close, you don't engage if people start talking, and if things get ugly, we leave. Understood? Understood. They rode into town an hour later, Rosalie on the smaller of his 2 horses, a gray mare named Ash who had a gentle disposition. The road was muddy from the storm, the horses' hooves making sucking sounds with each step. Neither of them spoke much during the ride. Elias kept glancing over at Rosalie, watching the way she sat the horse, the way her hands gripped the reins too tightly, the way her eyes scanned the horizon like she was expecting attack from any direction. Lark Hollow appeared gradually as they crested a low hill, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a main street that turned to mud every time it rained. Population 200 on a good day, less when the young people got smart and left for bigger opportunities in Cheyenne or Denver. It was the kind of town that existed because it always had, not because anyone particularly wanted to be there. They tied the horses outside McKenna's general store, and Elias could already feel eyes on them. Mrs. Hodges across the street, sweeping her porch. Old Tom Fletcher sitting outside the feed store. The Morrison twins, 19 years old and mean as snakes, leaning against a truck and smoking. "Ready?" Elias asked quietly. Rosalie nodded, but her face had gone pale. They climbed the steps to McKenna's, and Elias held the door for her. The bell above the door jangled, announcing their arrival. Frank McKenna looked up from behind the counter, his eyes widening slightly when he saw Rosalie. "Elias," Frank said carefully, "wasn't expecting you today. Storm kept me out longer than planned. Need to stock up." Frank's eyes kept drifting to Rosalie, taking in the bruises that were still visible despite having faded from purple to yellowish green, the borrowed men's clothes, the way she stood slightly behind Elias like she was using him as a shield. "And who's this?" "Friend of mine," Elias said, his tone making it clear that was all the explanation Frank would get. "Friend." Frank drew the word out. "Staying out at your place?" "That's right." "Huh." Frank went back to organizing his tobacco display, but Elias could see the wheels turning. By sunset, everyone in town would know. By tomorrow, there would be stories. They moved through the store gathering supplies. Elias grabbed his usual items: coffee, flour, sugar, bacon, beans, while Rosalie wandered the aisles slowly, running her fingers over things like she couldn't quite believe they were real. He found her standing in front of a display of women's dresses, staring at them with an expression he couldn't read. "Pick one," he said quietly. "I can't. They're too expensive." "Pick one anyway." "Elias, Rosalie, pick a dress. Pick two if you want. And grab whatever else you need. Underclothes, stockings, shoes, if they've got any that fit. Don't argue with me about it." She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I'll pay you back." "No, you won't. Now pick." She chose one dress, simple blue cotton with white buttons. She also selected undergarments, thick stockings, and a pair of sturdy boots that were slightly too large. Elias added them to his pile without comment and carried everything to the counter. Frank tallied it all up, his eyebrows climbing steadily higher. "That's quite a load. Winter's coming." "This is spring." "Next winter." Frank's mouth twitched like he wanted to smile, but wasn't sure if he should. "That'll be $42. Elias counted out the bills from his wallet, aware that he was spending close to a month's worth of careful budgeting in one go. Worth it, he told himself. All of it worth it. They were loading supplies into saddlebags when a voice cut across the street. "Well, well, Elias Cutter's got himself a woman." The Morrison twins had crossed over, matching sneers on their identical faces. Dale and Darren, 20 years old, and already halfway to becoming the kind of men who made other men cross the street to avoid them. "Keep walking, boys," Elias said without looking up. "That's not friendly," Dale said. "We're just making conversation." "Yeah," Darren added, "just wondering where you found this pretty thing. She don't look like she's from around here." Elias straightened slowly, putting himself between the twins and Rosalie. "I said keep walking." "What's the matter? She too good to talk to us?" Dale took a step closer, and Elias could smell cheap beer on his breath, drunk at noon on a Tuesday. Some things never changed. "She's none of your concern." "That ain't hospitable. Out here in the West, we're supposed to be friendly to strangers." Dale's eyes slid past Elias to Rosalie. "What's your name, honey? Where are you from?" Rosalie said nothing, but Elias could feel her fear like a physical thing. "I asked you a question," Dale said, his voice hardening. "And she don't owe you an answer," Elias replied. "Now step back before this becomes a problem." "Already a problem," Darren said, moving to flank them. "Problem is, you coming into town with some beat-up woman, playing house, thinking nobody's going to ask questions." "The only question," came a new voice, sharp and cold, "is why you boys are harassing my customers." Frank McKenna had stepped out of his store, shotgun cradled loosely in his arms, not pointing it at anyone, not yet. But the message was clear. The twins looked at Frank, looked at Elias, looked at each other. Whatever calculation they were running came out against them, because they both took a step back. "Just talking," Dale muttered. "Talk somewhere else." Frank's finger rested near the trigger guard. "Now." The Morrison twins slouched away, throwing back glances that promised this wasn't over. Elias let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "Thanks, Frank." "Don't thank me." Frank's expression was troubled. "I don't know what you've gotten yourself into, Elias. Maybe it's not my business. But those boys have mean streaks and they've got friends. You watch yourself." "Always do." Frank looked at Rosalie, really looked at her, and something like pity crossed his weathered face. "You too, miss. Whatever your story is, Lark Hollow's not kind to mysteries. People here, they like things simple and explained. You might want to think about that." He went back inside, the bell jangling behind him. They finished loading the horses in silence and mounted up. Elias could feel eyes tracking them as they rode down Main Street, curtains twitching in windows, people pausing their conversations to watch them pass. The weight of judgment and speculation pressed down like the air before a storm. They were almost to the edge of town when it happened. An old woman stepped into their path, forcing them to stop. Elias recognized her. Martha Winters, widow of John Winters, who'd owned the bank before he drank himself to death. She'd been a bitter woman even before that, and widowhood had only sharpened her edges. "Elias Cutter," she said, her voice carrying in the quiet street. "Heard you picked yourself up astray." "Mrs. Winters," Elias kept his voice neutral. "Need to get past." "In a minute. First, I want to get a look at what kind of woman shares a man's cabin without a ring on her finger." Rosalie's hands tightened on her reins, but she said nothing. "Not your concern," Elias said. "Everything in this town is my concern. I've lived here 63 years, longer than you've been alive, and I know trouble when I see it." Martha's eyes fixed on Rosalie with something close to hatred. "What are you, girl? Prostitute? Thief? Running from the law?" "She's none of those things." "Then what is she? Where'd she come from? Why she got bruises all over her face like someone beat the sin out of her, though clearly they didn't beat enough." "Mrs. Winters," Elias started, but Rosalie cut him off. "My name is Rosalie Turner," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor Elias could see in her hands. "I came from Sweetwater County. My father abandoned me, and Mr. Cutter helped me. That's all." "That's all?" Martha's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Honey, that's never all. Men don't help women for free, especially not men like Elias Cutter who've spent years hiding from decent society." "That's enough," Elias said, his voice hard. But Martha wasn't finished. She stepped closer to Rosalie's horse, reached up, and before anyone could stop her, she grabbed a handful of dirt from a planter and threw it at Rosalie's boots. "That's what I think of your kind," Martha spat. "Filth, coming here, corrupting good Christian folk with your sob stories and your loose ways. We don't want you here. We don't need you here." Rosalie stared down at the dirt on her boots, her face gone blank and empty. Elias felt rage rise, hot and red in his chest, but he forced it down. Violence wouldn't help. Not here, not now. "Come on," he said to Rosalie, guiding his horse around Martha. "Let's go home." They rode out of Lark Hollow in silence, and Elias didn't look back, but he could feel the weight of the town's judgment following them like a curse. They were halfway home when Rosalie finally spoke. "She's right." "No, she's not." "She is. I am filth. I'm damaged and broken, and I bring trouble everywhere I go. You should have left me on that fence." Elias pulled his horse to a stop so abruptly that Rosalie had to rein in Ash to avoid passing him. He turned in his saddle to face her fully. "You listen to me," he said, his voice low and intense. "That bitter old woman threw dirt at you because she spent so long drowning in her own misery that she can't stand to see anyone trying to climb out of theirs. Her opinion means nothing. The town's opinion means nothing. The only thing that matters is what you know about yourself." "And what do I know? That my father hated me? That I'm so worthless he left me to die?" "No. You know that you survived. You know that you're stronger than anything that was done to you. You know that you're here, right now, alive and breathing, and getting better every day." Tears were streaming down Rosalie's face now. "How do you know that? How do you know I'm not exactly what she said I am?" Because, Elias said simply, I've seen real filth. I've seen real corruption. And you're neither. You're just someone who got dealt a bad hand and is trying to figure out how to play it. There's no shame in that. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. You didn't fight her. No. Why not? Because fighting her would have proved her right, would have made you look like something that needed defending instead of someone with dignity of their own. The best response to hate like that is showing it can't touch you. But it did touch me. It hurt. I know. But you didn't let her see that. You held your head up. You told her your name. You looked her in the eye. That takes more courage than throwing a punch ever would. Rosalie was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then she said, You're a strange man, Elias Cutter. So you keep saying, I mean it though. You're different from anyone I've ever met. Different good or different bad? A small smile touched her lips. Still figuring that out. They rode the rest of the way home in a silence that felt less heavy than before. The cabin appeared over the hill like a promise, small and sturdy against the vast Wyoming sky. That night, after they'd put away the supplies and eaten a simple dinner, Rosalie put on the new dress. It fit her well, brought out the color in her eyes, made her look less like a survivor of catastrophe and more like a young woman with a future. She stood in front of the small mirror Elias had in the bedroom, touching the fabric gently. It's beautiful, she said when she noticed him watching from the doorway. It suits you. Thank you. For today. For the dress. For... She trailed off, struggling with words. For showing me that dignity can be louder than hate. Elias nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude as always. Just remember it tomorrow when you're doubting yourself again. I will. She turned to face him. Elias, can I ask you something? Depends what it is. That woman in town, Mrs. Winters, she said you'd been hiding from decent society. What did she mean? He should have expected the question, but it still caught him off guard. Old history, not worth talking about. I told you about my father, about what he did. Seems only fair you tell me something. She had a point. Elias leaned against the door frame, weighing how much to say, how much to keep buried. I told you I had a sister, he said finally. What I didn't tell you is that after she died, I blamed myself so much I couldn't function, started drinking, fighting, making trouble, got arrested a few times, made a mess of my life. What changed? Woke up one morning in a jail cell and realized I was becoming exactly like my father, mean drunk, angry at the world, hurting everyone around me. So I stopped, quit drinking, moved out here, built this place, stayed away from people because people reminded me of who I'd been. And you've been alone ever since. Until now. Rosalie studied him with those dark, knowing eyes. You're not going to become your father, Elias. You're nothing like him. How do you know? Because your father wouldn't have cut me down from that fence. He would have walked past. But you didn't. It was such a simple observation, but it hit him with unexpected force. All these years, he'd been so afraid of becoming the monster that raised him that he'd forgotten to notice all the ways he was different. Thank you, he said quietly, for saying that. Just returning the favor. They stood there in the doorway of the small bedroom while darkness gathered outside and the temperature dropped toward freezing. Two damaged people, slowly learning that maybe, just maybe, they could help each other heal. The next morning, Elias was repairing the porch railing when he heard horses approaching. Not one horse, several. He straightened, hand instinctively moving toward the rifle leaning against the cabin wall. 5 riders came into view, moving slowly up his drive. Elias recognized the lead horse immediately, a big black gelding that belonged to Marcus Devlin, owner of the largest ranch in the county and the closest thing Lark Hollow had to an aristocrat. This wasn't going to be good. Rosalie emerged from the cabin, saw the riders, and went very still. Who are they? Trouble, Elias said. Get inside. Don't come out no matter what you hear. Elias, Now, Rosalie. She hesitated, then disappeared back into the cabin. Elias picked up his rifle, held it casually across his chest, and waited. Marcus Devlin dismounted first, followed by 4 of his ranch hands. All of them were armed. Devlin himself was in his 50s, silver-haired and handsome in the way that money and power allowed. He smiled as he approached the porch, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Elias Cutter," he said, voice smooth as oil. "Been a while." "Not long enough. What do you want, Devlin?" "Just being neighborly. Heard you had a guest. Thought I'd come introduce myself." "She's not interested." "Now, that's not very hospitable. Here in the West, we welcome strangers properly. And here on my land, I decide who's welcome and who's not. You're not." Devlin's smile sharpened. "You always were difficult, Cutter. But you should know, that girl you're harboring, she's wanted." "Wanted by who?" "By her father, Earl Turner. He came to me yesterday, distraught, saying his daughter ran off with a drifter. Said she was confused, influenced by bad company, asked me to help bring her home." Elias's grip tightened on his rifle. "Earl Turner left his daughter tied to a fence to die. If he told you different, he's lying. That's a serious accusation." "It's the truth." "Truth is a funny thing, though, isn't it? Could be you're the one lying. Could be you saw a vulnerable girl and took advantage. Could be Earl Turner is a concerned father trying to save his daughter from a predator." The four ranch hands spread out slightly, casual but deliberate, cutting off potential escape routes. Elias noticed but didn't react. "Let me make this simple," Devlin continued. "Give us the girl, and we'll forget this whole misunderstanding. You can go back to your quiet life, no trouble, no problems." "And if I refuse?" "Then we take her anyway, and you get hurt in the process. Shame, really, but the law would be on our side. Man can defend his property rights, after all." "She's not property." "Earl says she is. He's her father. He has rights." Elias's finger moved closer to the trigger. "Only right he has is to rot for what he did." Devlin sighed, like he was dealing with a stubborn child. Elias, you're outnumbered, outgunned, and on the wrong side of the law. Be smart. Hand her over." "No." The word hung in the air, simple and final. Devlin's expression hardened. "I was hoping you'd be reasonable." "Reasonable left when you rode onto my land with armed men and threatened me. Now you've got 10 seconds to get back on those horses and leave before I start shooting." "You'd kill 5 men over some girl you barely know?" "I'd kill 5 men who came to take someone under my protection. Now you're down to 5 seconds. For a long moment, nobody moved. The ranch hands looked at Devlin, waiting for orders. Devlin looked at Elias, calculating odds, weighing costs. Finally, he smiled again, cold and promising violence. "This isn't over, Cutter. Not by a long shot. That girl will be returned to her rightful guardian, one way or another. Only way she leaves here is if she chooses to, and I don't think that's going to happen." Devlin mounted his horse, the others following suit. "You just made a powerful enemy. Wouldn't be the first." They rode away slowly, deliberately, letting their presence linger like a threat. Elias didn't lower his rifle until they disappeared over the hill. When he turned around, Rosalie was standing in the doorway. She'd heard everything. "Who was that?" she asked, though her face suggested she already knew. "Marcus Devlin, richest man in the county. He owns half the land around here, has the sheriff in his pocket, and doesn't like being told no. And now he's after me. Now he thinks you're property that needs returning, but he's wrong. Elias, maybe I should just go, before people get hurt because of me." He set the rifle down and climbed the porch steps until he was standing in front of her. "You listen to me. These men, they don't care about you. They care about power, about showing they can take what they want. If we let them win here, they'll keep doing it to other people, in other situations. Someone has to stand up to them." "Why does it have to be you?" "Because I can. Because I have this land and these walls and enough stubbornness to make it stick. And because," he paused, searching for the right words, "because 12 years ago I failed someone who needed help. I'm not failing again." Tears welled in Rosalie's eyes. "You barely know me." "I know enough." She threw her arms around him then, sudden and surprising, burying her face in his chest. Elias stood frozen for a moment, uncertain, then slowly wrapped his arms around her shoulders and let her cry. They stood like that while the sun climbed higher and the wind whispered through the sage. Two people holding on to each other against a world that wanted to tear them apart. And Elias realized, with something like wonder and terror combined, that maybe being alone wasn't safer after all. Maybe connection was worth the risk. Maybe she was worth the risk. They spent the rest of that day preparing. Elias checked every window latch, reinforced the barn door with extra boards, and moved his ammunition from the shed into the cabin where he could reach it quickly. Rosalie watched him work with growing anxiety, understanding finally settling over her like a shroud. This wasn't going to end peacefully. "Do you really think they'll come back?" she asked as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. Elias was loading his rifle, checking the mechanism with practiced efficiency. Men like Devlin don't make threats they don't intend to keep. "Yeah, they'll come back. Question is when. Maybe tonight? Maybe. Or maybe they'll wait, let us get comfortable, then hit us when we're not expecting it." He looked up at her, his expression serious. "You know how to shoot?" "My father taught me when I was younger. Before—" She trailed off. "Before he started drinking away his grief and your childhood along with it," Elias finished quietly. "Can you still remember?" "I think so." He handed her a smaller rifle, older but well-maintained. "This was Mary's, my sister's. She was a better shot than me by the time she was 16. If something happens, if someone gets past me, you use this. Aim center mass, squeeze, don't pull, and don't hesitate. These men won't." Rosalie took the rifle with trembling hands. The weight of it felt wrong, too heavy with implication. "I don't want to kill anyone." "Neither do I. But wanting and having to are different things." Elias moved to the window, scanning the horizon. "With luck, it won't come to that. With luck, they'll realize the cost is too high and leave us alone. And without luck? Without luck, we fight." Night fell hard and fast, the way it did in Wyoming when spring hadn't quite convinced winter to leave. Elias kept the lamps turned low, just bright enough to see by, but not bright enough to silhouette them against the windows. They ate a cold dinner of bread and cheese because cooking smells carried on the wind and might draw attention. Rosalie sat at the table, Mary's rifle across her lap, jumping at every creak of the cabin, settling, or rustle of wind through the eaves. "Try to relax," Elias said from his position by the front window. "Tension makes you slow." "How can I relax? There are men out there who want to drag me back to my father, or worse." "Worse?" She was quiet for a moment, then said, "That man Devlin. The way he looked at me. It wasn't like he saw a person. It was like he saw something he wanted to own." Elias's jaw tightened. "He's not touching you. You can't promise that. Watch me." They sat in tense silence as the hours crawled past. Midnight came and went. 1 in the morning, 2. Elias never moved from the window, never relaxed his vigilance. Rosalie dozed fitfully in the chair, waking with small gasps every time exhaustion pulled her under. Around 3 in the morning, she jerked fully awake to find Elias standing rigid, his rifle raised. "What is it?" she whispered. "Horses. Coming slow, trying to be quiet." Rosalie's heart hammered against her ribs. "How many?" "Can't tell yet. At least 3, maybe more." He glanced back at her. "Get in the bedroom. Lock the door. Don't come out unless I call for you or someone breaks through. I'm not hiding while you fight alone." "Rosalie, no. You said I wasn't property. You said I had dignity. Well, dignified people don't hide while others defend them. I'm staying." Elias looked like he wanted to argue, but there wasn't time. The sound of horses had stopped, which meant the riders had dismounted, which meant they were approaching on foot. "Stay low," he said instead. "Cover the back window. Anyone tries to come through, you shoot." She moved to the rear of the cabin, positioning herself where she could see both the back window and door. Her hands were slick with sweat on the rifle stock. The silence stretched out, broken only by the pounding of her own pulse in her ears. Then a voice called out from the darkness, slurred and familiar and full of false authority. "Rosalie, Rosalie Turner, you come out here right now." Her father, Earl Turner, had come. "I know you're in there, girl. I know you got yourself tangled up with that drifter cutter, but it ain't too late. You come home now, we'll forget this whole thing." Elias didn't respond, didn't move. Smart, Rosalie thought. Don't give away positions. "I'm your father, Rosalie. I got rights. That man in there, he's got no claim on you. You belong with family." "Family doesn't leave people tied to fences," Elias called back, his voice carrying clearly through the closed door. That was a mistake. I was drunk, confused, but I'm sober now, and I want my daughter back. She's not yours to want. She's her own person, and she's chosen to stay here. The hell she has. She's 18 years old, don't know what's good for her. Now you send her out or we're coming in. We? Elias's voice was deceptively calm. Who's we, Earl? You bring friends to help threaten your own daughter. There was a pause, then Earl said, Mr. Devlin's here. He's been kind enough to help me out in my time of need. Says you got no legal right to harbor my girl against my wishes. And I say Earl Turner's got no right to a daughter he tried to kill. Seems we're at an impasse. Movement at the back window made Rosalie's breath catch. A shadow, low and careful, testing the shutters. She raised the rifle, aimed at center mass like Elias had taught her, and called out quietly. Someone's at the back. Hold steady, Elias replied. Then louder. I've got guns pointed at every entry point, Earl. Anyone comes through those doors or windows is getting shot. That what you want? Your friend's blood on your hands? This is your last warning, Cutter. That was Devlin's voice now, smooth even in anger. Send the girl out, or we're coming in, and whatever happens is on you. Whatever happens is on you, Elias corrected. You're the ones threatening violence on a man's property. Self-defense is pretty clear in Wyoming law. Law's on our side. Earl Turner's her legal guardian. He has rights. Not anymore, he doesn't. Girls of age, and even if she wasn't, attempted murder voids parental rights pretty damn conclusively. The shadow at the back window was doing something to the shutters, working at the latch with a tool of some kind. Rosalie's finger moved to the trigger, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Elias, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. They're breaking in. Don't shoot unless they come through. The shutter latch gave with a crack of wood. The window swung open and a man started to climb through, one of Devlin's ranch hands, young and stupid enough to think this was worth his life. Rosalie fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The man screamed and fell backward out of the window. She'd aimed high deliberately, hitting his shoulder instead of his chest, but he was down, and that was what mattered. All hell broke loose. The front door exploded inward as someone hit it with what must have been a battering ram. Elias fired twice in quick succession, and someone outside cried out. Glass shattered as a rock came through the side window. Smoke started seeping under the door. They'd lit something, were trying to smoke them out. Bedroom, Elias shouted. Now! Rosalie ran, stumbling over furniture in the dim light. Elias was right behind her, firing over his shoulder as he moved. They crashed through the bedroom door and Elias slammed it shut, shoving the dresser in front of it with strength born of desperation. The window, he gasped. Out the window. What about you? I'm right behind you. Go. Rosalie threw open the bedroom window and looked out. It was a 6-foot drop to the ground, manageable. She threw the rifle out first, then climbed onto the sill. Behind her, someone was hammering on the bedroom door, shouting threats and obscenities. She jumped. The impact jarred her knees, but she rolled with it, came up holding the rifle. Elias landed beside her a second later, and together they ran for the barn where the horses were kept. Behind them, men were pouring into the cabin. She heard Earl's voice, drunk and victorious. Find her! She can't have gone far! They reached the barn and Elias practically threw her onto Ash's back. He mounted his own horse in one smooth motion, and they burst out of the barn at a gallop. Gunfire erupted behind them. A bullet whined past Rosalie's ear. Another kicked up dirt to her left. But the darkness was their friend now, swallowing them as they raced away from the cabin toward the open rangeland beyond. They rode hard for 20 minutes before Elias finally slowed, letting the horses catch their breath. They'd climbed into the foothills, following a trail only Elias knew, and behind them the cabin was a distant glow. They'd set it on fire. Rosalie stared at that orange light against the black sky and felt something break inside her. Your home. They burned your home. It's just wood and nails, Elias said, though his voice was tight. We're alive. That's what matters. This is my fault. All of this. This is their fault. Devlin's, your father's, all of them. Don't you dare take responsibility for other people's evil. They guided the horses along the ridgeline, moving slowly now, listening for sounds of pursuit. None came. Either Devlin thought they'd gotten away, or he was smart enough not to follow into the dark hills where Elias had the advantage. Dawn was breaking when they finally stopped beside a small creek that cut through a stand of pine trees. The horses drank gratefully while Elias and Rosalie collapsed on the bank, exhausted beyond words. "What do we do now?" Rosalie asked, staring at the pink-streaked sky. "We survive. We regroup. We figure out our next move. They'll keep coming. Devlin won't stop." "Probably not. But he's made a mistake." "What mistake?" Elias looked at her, something fierce and determined in his pale eyes. "He's made this personal. Before I was just helping you because it was the right thing, but now he's burned my home, threatened my life, and proved he's exactly the kind of man who needs to be stood up to. I'm not running anymore." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to the sheriff, the real sheriff, not the one in Lark Hollow who's in Devlin's pocket. State sheriff over in Casper. I'm going to tell him what happened, show him your injuries, explain how your father left you to die, and how Devlin's been terrorizing us to cover it up. You think he'll believe you?" "I think burned cabins and bullet wounds make a pretty convincing story. And I think Devlin's gotten arrogant, made mistakes, left witnesses. The man who climbed through the window, you shot him. That's evidence. The cabin fire, that's arson. The forced entry, that's home invasion. He's given us ammunition if we're smart enough to use it." Rosalie felt a small flicker of hope, fragile as candlelight. "And if the sheriff doesn't believe us? Then we figure something else out. But we don't give up, you understand me? We don't surrender." She nodded, though doubt still gnawed at her. Her whole life had been a series of surrenders, to her father's grief, to his violence, to the slow erosion of everything she'd once hoped to be. Fighting back felt foreign, dangerous, like trying to walk after years of crawling. But looking at Elias, dirty, exhausted, homeless because of his decision to protect her, she felt something shift. He'd lost everything and was still standing, still fighting, still believing that right could triumph over might if you just held on long enough. Maybe she could too. They rested for an hour as the sun climbed higher, warming the spring air and drying the dew from the grass. Elias checked their supplies, sparse, just what he'd managed to grab in the chaos, and rationed out some dried beef and water. "We'll need to be careful," he said. "Devlin has men everywhere, and your father probably knows these hills as well as I do. We can't go straight to Casper. We'll need to take the long way, stay off the main roads." "How long will that take?" 3 days, maybe 4 if we're being really cautious. Can you handle that?" Rosalie thought about the alternative, being dragged back to her father, or worse, falling into Devlin's hands for whatever purpose he'd decided she'd serve. "I can handle it." They set out again, following game trails and creek beds, staying under tree cover when possible. The Wyoming wilderness was vast and beautiful, and indifferent to human struggles. They passed through valleys carpeted with wildflowers, crossed ridges where the wind howled like lost souls, navigated forests so thick the sun barely penetrated. On the second night, camped in a small cave that offered shelter from the wind, Rosalie finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind since they'd fled. "Why didn't you just give me up? You could have told them to take me, saved your cabin, saved yourself all this trouble." Elias was tending a small fire, keeping it low so the light wouldn't show. He didn't answer right away, just stared into the flames, like they might hold answers. "You remember what I told you about my sister Mary?" he said finally. "That she died in a fire, that you left her behind. What I didn't tell you was that she wrote me letters. Every week for 2 years she wrote me, told me how bad things were getting with our father, asked me to come back to take her away, and I didn't. I was angry, scared, drowning in my own problems. I told myself she was exaggerating, that she'd be fine, that I couldn't help her even if I wanted to." His voice cracked slightly. "The fire that killed her? It wasn't an accident. She set it herself, burned the house down with her in it because she couldn't take another day with him and saw no other way out." Rosalie's breath caught. "Oh, Elias." "So you ask me why I didn't give you up? Because every time I look at you, I see Mary. I see another young woman trapped by a man who should have protected her, desperate for someone to help, and I'll be damned if I make the same choice twice. I couldn't save my sister, but I can save you. I will save you, even if it costs me everything." Tears were streaming down Rosalie's face. "I'm not worth everything." "That's not your decision to make." "But your home can be rebuilt. You can't. And I'd rather rebuild 100 cabins than live with the knowledge that I had a chance to do right and chose convenience instead. She moved around the fire and sat beside him, not touching but close enough to feel his warmth. You're a good man, Elias Cutter. Better than you think you are. I'm a man trying to atone. There's a difference. Is there? He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition that they were bound now by more than circumstance. They were bound by choice, by shared trauma, by the decision to stand together against a world that wanted to tear them apart. Get some sleep, he said softly. I'll take first watch. Wake me in a few hours. You need rest too. I will. She lay down near the fire, using her coat as a pillow. And despite everything, the fear, the exhaustion, the uncertainty, she felt safer than she had in years. Because for the first time in her life, someone had chosen her, not out of obligation or possession, but because they believed she mattered. That was worth more than all the cabins in Wyoming. The third day brought new dangers. They were following a narrow trail along a cliff face when they heard horses behind them, multiple riders, moving fast. Elias urged his horse forward, Rosalie keeping pace, and they broke into a gallop along the treacherous path. How many? Rosalie shouted over the thunder of hooves. 4, maybe 5. The trail ahead forked. Left led down into a valley where they'd be exposed. Right climbed higher into the mountains, but was steeper, more dangerous. Right, Elias called, making the decision. They took the climbing path, horses straining, rocks skittering away under their hooves. Behind them, the pursuit was gaining. Rosalie risked a glance back and saw Devlin himself leading the charge, his face twisted with fury. The trail got worse, narrower, steeper, places where one wrong step meant a 100-foot fall. Ash stumbled and Rosalie's heart stopped, but the mare caught herself, kept climbing. Then the trail ended. They came around a bend and there it was, a dead end, a sheer rock face rising up 50 feet with no way forward and no way back except through their pursuers. Off the horses, Elias said, already dismounting. Behind those rocks, we make our stand here. They took cover behind a jumble of boulders as Devlin and his men rounded the bend. The rancher pulled up short, seeing the situation, and smiled a smile that promised pain. End of the line, Cutter, he called out, dismounting. His men spread out, rifles drawn. You've led us on a merry chase, but it's over now. Send the girl out, and maybe I let you live. Not happening. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. Be reasonable. Reasonable would have been leaving us alone 3 days ago, but you burned my home, chased us into the mountains, and proved you're nothing but a bully with money. So here's my counteroffer. You and your men turn around, ride back to your ranch, and pray I never have enough evidence to see you hang for what you've done. Devlin laughed, harsh and mocking. Evidence? Out here? In these mountains? Cutter, if you die here, no one will ever find your body. And that girl becomes property of her legal guardian, which means she becomes mine to do with as I please. That's how this ends. Not while I'm breathing. Then stop breathing. Devlin raised his rifle, but before he could fire, a shot rang out from higher up the mountain. One of Devlin's men cried out and fell, clutching his leg. Everyone froze. Next one goes through someone's head, a new voice called down from above. So unless you boys want to die on this mountain today, I suggest you mount up and ride out. Elias's head snapped up, scanning the rocks. There, barely visible against the cliff face, a figure in buckskin and a wide-brimmed hat, rifle trained on Devlin's group. Who the hell are you? Devlin shouted. Name's Jack Thornton. I'm a federal marshal and you're interfering with witnesses in a criminal investigation. That tends to make me cranky. A federal marshal. Rosalie felt hope surge through her chest. I don't believe you, Devlin said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Don't care if you believe me. Care if you leave these folks alone. See, I've been tracking Earl Turner for the past week. Got word he abandoned his daughter to die, and I've been looking to have a conversation with him about that. Then I hear about a cabin burning, gunfights, pursuit through the mountains. Well, that paints a pretty clear picture of who's in the wrong here. This is a private matter. Attempted murder is a federal crime when it crosses county lines. So is arson, assault, and about 6 other things you've done in the last 72 hours. Now you've got 30 seconds to clear out before I start collecting bodies for evidence. Devlin's men were looking at each other nervously. The wounded one was bleeding badly, needed medical attention. The odds had shifted, and everyone knew it. "This isn't over," Devlin said, but he was backing toward his horse. "Yeah, it is," Marshal Thornton replied. "And Devlin, I'll be coming to ask you some questions real soon. Make sure you're available." They mounted up and rode away, supporting their wounded companion between two horses. Elias and Rosalie stayed behind the rocks until the sound of hooves faded completely. Then Marshal Thornton climbed down from his perch, moving with the easy grace of someone who'd spent years in rough country. He was older than Elias, maybe 50, with a weathered face and eyes that missed nothing. "You Elias Cutter?" he asked. "I am. This is Rosalie Turner." "Miss Turner?" Thornton tipped his hat. "Sorry about what your father put you through. Porum. No woman should have to endure that." "You're really a federal marshal?" Rosalie asked, hardly daring to believe their luck. "I am. Got word about your situation from a bartender in Sweetwater County who saw Earl Turner bragging about how he dealt with his troublesome daughter. Figured that warranted investigation. Been tracking you folks for 2 days." "Why didn't you reveal yourself sooner?" Elias asked. "Wanted to see how it played out. Wanted evidence of Devlin's involvement before I made my move. Man's got political connections, can make things difficult, but threatening witnesses, burning property, attempted murder, that's enough to start formal proceedings." "What happens now?" Rosalie asked. "Now we ride to Casper. I take your statements, document your injuries, build a case. Earl Turner will be arrested for attempted murder and child endangerment. Marcus Devlin will face charges for arson, assault, and conspiracy. And you two," he looked between them, "you two get to start over without those bastards hanging over your heads." It seemed too good to be true. Rosalie waited for the catch, the hidden cost, the moment when this turned into another nightmare. But Thornton just smiled, kind and genuine. "You're safe now, Miss Turner. Both of you. I give you my word." And somehow, impossibly, she believed him. They rode down from the mountains together, the federal marshal leading the way. Behind them, the high peaks caught the afternoon sun, turning gold and crimson. Ahead, the valley spread out green and promising. Rosalie looked over at Elias, saw him sitting straight in his saddle despite his exhaustion, saw the relief in the set of his shoulders. He'd kept his promise. He'd protected her, and now, finally, they might have a chance at peace. "Thank you," she said quietly, knowing the words weren't enough but needing to say them anyway. Elias met her eyes and nodded. "Thank you for trusting me, for standing with me, for being brave enough to fight. I learned that from you." "No, that was already in you. I just helped you remember it." Marshal Thornton glanced back at them, a knowing look on his weathered face. "You two make quite a team." "Just two people trying to survive," Elias said. "That's how most good partnerships start." They rode on through the lengthening shadows, 3 travelers bound by justice and survival, heading toward a future that for the first time in a long time looked like it might include hope. Casper was bigger than any town Rosalie had ever seen, with wide streets and brick buildings that spoke of prosperity and permanence. Marshal Thornton led them straight to the federal office, a solid structure near the center of town that radiated authority. People stopped to stare as they passed, 3 dusty travelers on exhausted horses, clearly coming from somewhere difficult. Inside, the marshal's office was surprisingly comfortable, with wooden chairs and a pot-bellied stove that kept the spring chill at bay. Thornton settled them with coffee and biscuits before disappearing into a back room to file his initial report. Rosalie sat clutching her cup, the warmth seeping into her cold hands. Across from her, Elias looked hollowed out, running on nothing but determination and coffee. His beard had grown wild over the past few days, and there were new lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. "You should rest," she said softly. "So should you." "I'm too nervous to rest. What if they don't believe us? What if Devlin's connections are too strong? What if—" "Stop." Elias leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "We've got a federal marshal on our side, physical evidence, and the truth. That has to count for something. Does it, though? In my experience, the truth just gets you hurt. That's because you've been dealing with men who feared the truth. But Thornton's different. You saw how he handled Devlin. He's not afraid. Before Rosalie could respond, Thornton returned with another man, older, distinguished, wearing a suit that marked him as someone important. The marshal made introductions. This is District Attorney Howard Chen. He'll be handling the prosecution once we have Earl Turner and Marcus Devlin in custody. Chen shook hands with both of them, his grip firm and professional. I've heard a summary of your situation from Marshal Thornton. What was done to you, Miss Turner, is unconscionable. I want to assure you that my office will pursue this case with every resource we have. Thank you, Rosalie managed, though the words felt inadequate. I'll need to take detailed statements from both of you. The process may be uncomfortable. You'll need to recount traumatic events, describe injuries, provide specifics about locations and times. Can you do that? Rosalie looked at Elias, drawing strength from his steady presence. Yes, I can do that. What followed were hours of careful questioning. Chen was thorough but kind, never pushing when she struggled with particularly painful memories, always giving her time to compose herself. She described the night her father tied her to the fence, the cold seeping into her bones, the terror of thinking she would die alone in the darkness. She showed them the scars on her wrists, faded now but still visible. She recounted the confrontation at Elias's cabin, the fire, the pursuit through the mountains. Elias corroborated everything, adding details about Devlin's threats, the forced entry, the arson. He spoke with a controlled anger that made clear how deeply the violations had cut. By the time they finished, night had fallen outside. Chen gathered his notes with satisfaction. This is solid, very solid. Marshal Thornton has already dispatched deputies to arrest Turner and Devlin. With your testimony, the physical evidence, and the marshal's own witness account, we should have convictions on multiple charges. How long will that take? Elias asked. Arraignment within 48 hours, trial probably within the month. Wyoming courts move quickly on federal cases. Chen stood, extending his hand again. You've both been through hell. The state will provide temporary housing while the legal proceedings unfold. There's a boarding house 2 blocks from here, clean, safe, respectable. I've already arranged rooms. I can pay my own way, Elias said quietly. I'm sure you can, Mr. Cutter. But given that you lost your home protecting a witness in a federal case, the least we can do is ensure you're not financially devastated in the process. Consider it compensation for services rendered to justice. After Chen left, Thornton walked them to the boarding house personally. The landlady, Mrs. Kowalski, was a round Polish woman with kind eyes who asked no questions and showed them to adjacent rooms on the second floor. Breakfast at 7, she said in accented English. Dinner at 6. You need anything, you ask. I take care of my boarders. Alone in her room, Rosalie stood at the window looking out over the unfamiliar town. Electric lights glowed in windows, a luxury she'd only seen a few times in her life. Somewhere out there, her father was probably being arrested. Somewhere else, Marcus Devlin was learning that money and connections couldn't protect him from everything. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she just felt exhausted. A soft knock at her door made her turn. Elias stood in the hallway, looking uncertain. Wanted to make sure you were all right, he said. I don't know what I am. Everything's happened so fast. You want company, or would you rather be alone? She considered. Alone meant silence and too much time to think. Company meant Elias, who'd become the one constant in a world that had turned upside down. Company, she decided. Please. He came in and they sat together on the small sofa under the window. Neither spoke for a long time, just sat in comfortable silence while the night sounds of Casper drifted up from the street below. What happens after? Rosalie asked finally. After the trial, after Devlin and my father are convicted, what happens to us? What do you want to happen? I don't know. I've spent so long just trying to survive that I never thought past it. Never let myself imagine a future that wasn't just more of the same. Elias was quiet, then said, I need to rebuild the cabin. Can't let Devlin's arson be the end of that place. My sister's buried there, under the oak tree on the east side. That land is the only thing I've got left of her. I didn't know she was buried there. Brought her ashes back myself after. Couldn't let her stay in that cemetery with our father. She deserved better. Rosalie reached out tentatively and took his hand. His fingers were calloused and strong, scarred from years of hard work. I'd like to help. With the rebuilding, if you'll have me. He looked at her, something vulnerable in his expression. You sure? That's a hard life, Rosalie. Isolated, difficult. You're 18 years old. You could go anywhere, do anything. Why tie yourself to a burned-out homestead and a damaged man with too much past? Because that damaged man saved my life. Because that homestead is the first place I ever felt safe. Because she struggled to find the right words. Because for the first time in my life, I get to choose. Not my father, not circumstances, not desperation. Me. And I choose to stay. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you're kind. I know you're brave. I know you keep your promises even when it costs you everything. That's more than most people can say. Elias's thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand. It won't be easy. Nothing worth having ever is. You might get tired of me, might decide you want something different. Then I'll tell you and we'll figure it out. But I won't run. I'm done running. He pulled her close then, wrapping his arms around her in an embrace that felt like coming home. Rosalie pressed her face against his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart, letting it anchor her in the present moment. We'll rebuild together, he said quietly. Make something better than what was there before. Together, she agreed. They stayed like that until Elias finally pulled back, standing reluctantly. You should sleep. Tomorrow's going to be another long day. Will you be all right? In your room, alone? He smiled, small and genuine. I've been alone 12 years. One more night won't kill me. Besides, I'm not really alone anymore, am I? No, you're not. After he left, Rosalie prepared for bed in a daze of exhaustion and cautious hope. The sheets were clean, the mattress soft, and for the first time in a week she felt truly safe. She fell asleep almost immediately and didn't dream. The next 2 days passed in a blur of legal proceedings. Earl Turner was arrested without incident. Thornton found him passed out drunk in a rooming house in Sweetwater County. Devlin put up more resistance, hiring expensive lawyers who argued jurisdiction and evidence and a dozen other technical points. But Chen was prepared for all of it, and the charges stuck. Rosalie had to testify at the arraignment, standing before a judge and recounting again what her father had done. Earl wouldn't meet her eyes, just stared at the floor while she spoke. When she finished, the judge set bail at $10,000, an impossible sum for a man who'd drunk away his savings. Defendant will remain in custody until trial, the judge declared. And that was that. Devlin's arraignment was more dramatic. His lawyers argued that he was merely trying to help a concerned father, that any violence was the result of Elias's aggression, that the whole situation had been blown out of proportion. Chen systematically dismantled each argument with evidence and witness testimony. Marshal Thornton's account of the mountain confrontation was particularly damning. The judge set Devlin's bail at $50,000, which he posted immediately. But there were conditions. He was forbidden from leaving the state or contacting either Rosalie or Elias. Electronic monitoring would track his movements. This isn't over, Devlin said as he left the courthouse, looking directly at Elias. You've made enemies you can't afford. Already had those, Elias replied calmly. One more won't make much difference. Back at the boarding house that evening, Mrs. Kowalski served them dinner with her other boarders, a school teacher, a bank clerk, and an elderly couple who asked no questions but offered quiet support through kind glances and passed dishes. After dinner, Elias and Rosalie walked through the town. Spring was settling in properly now, trees budding and the air carrying the scent of growing things. Casper felt alive in a way Lark Hollow never had, full of possibility and movement. I wired what's left of my savings today, Elias said as they walked. Should be enough to buy lumber and supplies for rebuilding. Won't be fancy, but it'll be solid. When can we start? Trial's set for 3 weeks from now. After that, once everything's settled, we'll head back. Maybe 2 months before we're living there again. 2 months? Rosalie tried to imagine it. What do we do in the meantime? Live? Rest? Heal? He glanced at her. There's things you should think about, too. You never finish school. There's a teacher here who might be willing to tutor you, help you get your certificate. You're smart, Rosalie. You could have options beyond just being a homesteader's helper. Is that what I'd be? Your helper? I don't know what you'd be. That's for you to decide. She was quiet for a moment, then said, I think I'd like to learn. Not because I want to leave, but because I want to choose to stay knowing I could do something else. Does that make sense? Perfect sense. They walked past a small church where singing drifted through open doors, hymns she half remembered from childhood before her mother died and her father stopped believing in anything but the bottom of a bottle. On impulse, she pulled Elias toward the sound. Come on. I don't do church. Neither do I, but sometimes it's nice to hear people singing about hope, even if you're not sure you believe it yet. They slipped into a back pew, anonymous among the congregation. The hymn was something about grace and redemption, about being lost and found. Rosalie didn't know the words, but she listened to the voices rising together in harmony and felt something unknot in her chest. Beside her, Elias sat rigid at first, uncomfortable. But gradually he relaxed, and when she glanced over, she saw his eyes were closed and his lips were moving slightly, like he was praying or remembering how to. After the service, they walked back through streets growing dark, and Elias said, My sister Mary used to love singing, had a voice like an angel, used to sing while she worked, while she cooked, just all the time. I'd forgotten that until just now. It's a good memory. Yeah, it is. He looked up at the stars beginning to appear. Thank you for reminding me that not all memories have to hurt. Some of them can heal, Rosalie said softly. If we let them. The trial began 3 weeks later, and Casper's courthouse was packed. News of the case had spread. A young woman abandoned to die by her father, a rancher who thought his money put him above the law, a cowboy who'd stood up to both. People loved a story with clear villains and heroes, even if the reality was more complicated. Chen prosecuted with calm precision, building his case witness by witness. Marshal Thornton testified about finding them on the mountain, about Devlin's threats. Frank McKenna came from Lark Hollow to testify about seeing Rosalie's injuries, about the Morrison twins harassing her, about the tension that had been building. Even Mrs. Kowalski testified, speaking about Rosalie's nightmares and Elias's protective vigilance. Then it was Rosalie's turn. She walked to the witness stand, feeling like she might fly apart from nerves. The courtroom was full of strangers, all watching her, judging her. Earl sat at the defendant's table, looking smaller than she remembered, diminished by sobriety and shame. Devlin sat straighter, arrogant even in defeat, his expensive lawyers flanking him like guards. Chen approached the stand with a gentle expression. Miss Turner, can you tell the court what happened on the night of March 15th? She took a breath and began. The words came easier than she expected, like something that had been dammed up was finally flowing free. She described her father's escalating violence, the drinking that got worse after each failed crop and each unpaid bill. She described the night he dragged her from the house, how she'd begged and pleaded, how he'd wrapped the baling wire around her wrists with hands that used to hold her when she cried. He said I was worthless, she told the silent courtroom. Said I'd killed my mother by being such a burden. Said maybe the cold would solve his problem, or maybe someone would find me and put me to some use. Then he drove away and left me there. How long were you tied to that fence? I don't know. Hours. Long enough that I couldn't feel my hands anymore, long enough that I started to think dying might be easier than holding on. What stopped you from giving up? Rosalie's eyes found Elias in the gallery. I heard someone coming, heard boots on gravel. I thought it might be my father coming back, and I didn't know if I wanted that or not. But it wasn't him. It was Elias Cutter, and he cut me down, and he told me I wasn't livestock. That was the first time anyone had treated me like a person in longer than I could remember. Earl Turner's lawyer tried to cross-examine, suggesting she was exaggerating, that her father had only meant to scare her into better behavior, that she was a difficult teenager who'd driven him to desperation. But every question just gave Rosalie another chance to describe exactly what had been done to her, and the jury's expressions grew harder with each answer. Devlin's lawyers took a different approach, trying to paint him as a good Samaritan misunderstood, a man simply trying to help return a daughter to her concerned father. But when Chen produced evidence of the burned cabin, the bullet holes, the testimony of the ranch hand Rosalie had shot, that narrative collapsed. The prosecution rested after 4 days. The defense tried to mount a case, but had nothing to work with except character assassination, and even that fell flat. Earl Turner was a known drunk. Marcus Devlin had a history of using his wealth to bully smaller landowners. The facts were damning. Closing arguments were brief. Chen laid out a simple timeline: attempted murder, conspiracy, arson, assault. These men believed they were above the law, he told the jury. They believed money and familial authority gave them the right to destroy lives. Your verdict will tell them, and everyone like them, whether they were right or wrong. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Earl Turner put his face in his hands. Marcus Devlin's expression remained cold, calculating even in defeat. The judge gavelled for order and set sentencing for the following week. Outside on the courthouse steps, reporters swarmed them. Elias pulled Rosalie close, shielding her from the worst of it while Thornton and Chen handled the questions. She heard phrases like justice served and victory for the voiceless, but it all felt distant, unreal. They escaped finally to a small restaurant where Chen had arranged a private room. Over steaks and potatoes, the district attorney raised his glass. To justice, and to two of the bravest people I've had the privilege to represent. They toasted, though Elias drank only water, and Rosalie noticed, appreciated the gesture. No alcohol, no echoes of Earl Turner's weakness. "What happens now?" Rosalie asked. "Sentencing in a week," Chen replied. "Turner will likely get 15 to 20 years. Devlin might get less due to his lawyers and lack of direct involvement in the initial abandonment, but he'll serve time. And there are civil suits to consider. You could sue both of them for damages." "I don't want their money," Rosalie said immediately. "You might change your mind when you're trying to rebuild a life. Think about it." After dinner, Elias and Rosalie walked back to the boarding house through streets celebrating their victory. Strangers called out congratulations. Someone even started to applaud as they passed. "I don't like this attention," Elias muttered. "It'll pass. Tomorrow there'll be some other news, some other story. Can't come soon enough." In the boarding house parlor, Mrs. Kowalski had laid out cake and coffee. "For celebrating," she announced. "Is good when bad men lose, good men win." They celebrated quietly with the other boarders, accepting congratulations and well wishes. But eventually exhaustion won out and Rosalie excused herself, climbing the stairs to her room. She was preparing for bed when Elias knocked softly. "Come in." He entered, looking uncertain. "I wanted to say, I'm proud of you. What you did today, testifying, facing them down. That took courage most people don't have. I was terrified. That's what courage is. Being terrified and doing it anyway." Rosalie sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly feeling the weight of everything that had happened. Is it really over? Can we actually go home and rebuild and just live? Yeah, we can. What if I'm not good at it? Living peacefully, I mean. What if I don't know how? Elias crossed the room and knelt in front of her, taking her hands. Then we'll learn together. That's what people do, Rosalie. They learn and they grow and they make mistakes and they try again. Neither of us knows how to do this, how to build something good from all this damage, but we've got time and we've got each other, and that's enough to start. She looked down at their joined hands, his so much larger than hers, scarred and strong. I'm scared. Of what? Of being happy. Of getting used to it and then having it taken away. Can't promise that won't happen. Life doesn't come with guarantees, but I can promise I'll be there. Whatever comes, whatever happens, you won't face it alone. Not anymore. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and Elias reached up to wipe them away with his thumbs, gentle despite his calloused hands. You're not alone either, she whispered. Not anymore. He smiled then, genuine and warm, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked young, not worn down by guilt and isolation, but hopeful. Get some rest, he said, standing. Tomorrow we start planning the rebuild. Tomorrow, she agreed. After he left, Rosalie lay in bed thinking about tomorrows, thinking about a cabin rising from ashes, about land she'd help work, about a future she'd help build, thinking about Elias teaching her to read the weather and mend fences and all the practical skills she'd need, thinking about learning to trust that good things could last. Outside her window, Casper settled into nighttime quiet. Somewhere in a jail cell, her father was learning what consequences felt like. Somewhere else, Marcus Devlin was plotting appeals that would ultimately fail. But here, in this small room in this temporary home, Rosalie Turner was finally, truly safe. And in the morning, she'd wake up and take another step toward a life she'd never imagined possible. A life she chose. A life with someone who saw her not as property or burden or mistake, but as a person worth saving, worth knowing, worth keeping. That was worth every hard thing that had come before. That was worth everything. Sentencing came on a gray morning that threatened rain. Earl Turner received 20 years for attempted murder and child endangerment, no possibility of parole for at least 15. He'd grown thinner during the weeks in custody, the alcohol finally leaching out of his system, leaving behind a hollow man who looked decades older than his 53 years. When the judge pronounced sentence, Earl finally looked at Rosalie, not with anger or defiance, but with something that might have been regret, though it came far too late to matter. Rosalie met his gaze steadily and felt nothing. Not forgiveness, not hatred, just a profound emptiness where her father used to live in her heart. He'd made his choices, and now he'd live with the consequences. She'd made hers too, and they led in a different direction entirely. Marcus Devlin got 12 years for arson, conspiracy, and assault. His lawyers immediately filed appeals, but Chen assured them the convictions would stand. "We built an airtight case," he told Elias and Rosalie afterward. "Devlin will serve his time, and when he gets out, he'll find his reputation destroyed. Sometimes that's worse than prison for men like him." After the sentencing, there was paperwork to sign, final statements to give, endless administrative details that marked the official end of their ordeal. By the time they emerged from the courthouse, the threatened rain had arrived, falling in sheets that turned the streets to rivers of mud. They ran back to the boarding house, arriving soaked and laughing despite everything. Mrs. Kowalski clucked over them like a mother hen, bringing towels and hot tea and sitting them by the fire to dry. "Now you can go home," she said, satisfaction in her voice. "Build new life, be happy. You earned this." That night, Elias spread out his plans for rebuilding the cabin. He'd been working on them for weeks, sketching and calculating, figuring out what could be salvaged and what needed replacing. Rosalie sat beside him at the table, studying the drawings with growing excitement. "It's bigger than before," she observed. "Figured if there's two of us, we need more space. Added a proper bedroom, made the kitchen larger, included a storage room for winter supplies." He glanced at her. "If that's all right with you." "It's perfect. Can we add a porch? A real one, big enough for chairs where we can sit in the evenings?" "Already drew it in. See here?" He pointed to the sketch. "Runs the whole front of the cabin, covered roof, facing east so we can watch the sunrise." Rosalie traced the lines with her finger, imagining it built and real. "When can we start?" "Day after tomorrow. I've arranged for lumber delivery to the property, hired 2 men from town to help with the heavy construction. Should have the frame up in a week, walls and roof in 2 more. Be living there again by early summer." "I can't wait." Elias rolled up the plans carefully. "There's something else we should talk about. Your future. Chen mentioned you could sue for damages, and even if you don't want their money, there's a victims fund that provides compensation. Could be enough to pay for school or training in something you're interested in." "I told you, I want to help rebuild." "I know, but Rosalie, you're 18 years old. Your whole life is ahead of you. I don't want you limiting yourself because you think you owe me something." She set down her teacup with a sharp click. "Is that what you think this is? Obligation?" "No, because if that's what you think, then you haven't been paying attention. I'm not staying because I owe you. I'm staying because I want to. Because for the first time in my life, I get to choose what I do and where I go and who I'm with. And I choose this. I choose you. I choose that land and that cabin and building, something that's ours." "Ours," Elias repeated quietly. "Yes, ours. Unless you don't want—" "I want," he interrupted. "God, Rosalie, I want that more than I've wanted anything in 12 years. I'm just trying to make sure you understand what you're signing up for. It's hard work, isolated living, long winters with nothing but each other for company. Most people would find that suffocating." "Most people aren't me." She reached across the table and took his hand. "I've lived in suffocation, Elias. Real suffocation, where every breath feels like drowning. This? This is freedom. The space to breathe, the chance to build something meaningful, someone who sees me as a partner instead of a burden. That's not limiting, that's liberation. He turned her hand over in his, studying her palm like it held answers. You sure? I've never been more sure of anything. All right then. He looked up, met her eyes. Partners. In everything. Partners, she agreed. They left Casper 3 days later with a wagon full of supplies and 2 hired workers, brothers named Tom and Samuel, who asked no questions and worked hard. The journey back to Elias's land took 2 days, and with every mile, Rosalie felt something lighten in her chest. This was the right direction. This was home. The cabin was worse than she'd feared. The fire had consumed most of the structure, leaving only the stone chimney standing amid charred timbers and ashes. The barn had survived, though it needed repairs. The fence line was intact, and seeing it, remembering the morning Elias had found her there, Rosalie felt a strange gratitude. That fence had been the site of her lowest moment, but also her salvation. We'll clear this first, Elias said, surveying the damage. Save what we can, burn the rest, start fresh with clean ground. They worked from dawn to dusk, all 5 of them, hauling away debris and sorting through the ruins. Rosalie found remnants of her brief time there, a fork she'd used, a chipped plate, the frame of the chair where she'd sat drinking coffee while Elias mended his bridle. Small things that had somehow survived when everything else burned. On the 3rd day of clearing, she found something else. A small wooden box, blackened by smoke but intact, buried under what had been the bedroom floor. She opened it carefully and found photographs. Elias and a young woman who must have been Mary, both smiling, both looking younger and less damaged than Rosalie had ever seen Elias look. She brought it to him where he was working on the new foundation. He took the box with trembling hands, staring at the photographs like they were relics from another life. I thought these were lost, he said hoarsely. Thought I'd lost her all over again. She's still here, Rosalie said gently. In these photos, in your memories, in that oak tree where you laid her to rest. She's still here, Elias. He wiped at his eyes roughly, embarrassed by the tears. Thank you for finding these, for understanding why they matter. She was important to you. That makes her important to me. They buried the box in a waterproof container under the foundation of the new cabin. So she's part of it, Elias explained. Part of what we're building. Her memory, her story, woven into the bones of our home. Rosalie thought it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard. The work was brutally hard. Rosalie's hands blistered and bled, her muscles screaming from labor she'd never done before. But Elias taught her patiently. How to measure twice and cut once, how to read a level, how to drive nails straight. Tom and Samuel treated her with easy respect, never questioning her presence or her capability, just accepting her as part of the crew. At night, they camped in the barn, too exhausted for much conversation, just falling asleep to the sound of horses breathing and wood settling. But sometimes, in this quiet darkness, Elias would reach across the space between their bedrolls and take her hand, and they'd fall asleep connected, 2 people slowly building something that went deeper than timber and nails. The frame went up faster than expected. By the end of the 2nd week, they had walls. By the 3rd week, the roof was on and windows were installed. The cabin took shape piece by piece, better than what had been there before. Stronger, larger, built to last. While the men worked on finishing the interior, Rosalie started on the land around the cabin. She planted a garden near the kitchen door, putting in seeds for vegetables and herbs. She cleared brush from around the oak tree where Mary's ashes rested, making it a place of peace instead of sorrow. She even started building a proper henhouse, figuring chickens would give them eggs and something living to care for besides themselves. One evening, as the sun painted the sky red and gold, Elias found her sitting under the oak tree. He settled beside her, groaning slightly as his sore muscles protested. Getting old, he said with a rueful smile. You're 31. That's hardly ancient. Feels ancient after 3 weeks of construction. He looked around at the progress they'd made. We're almost done. Another week and we can move in properly. It's beautiful, Elias. Better than I imagined. It's home. He paused, then added, our home. Rosalie leaned her head on his shoulder, comfortable in the silence between them. They'd been living in each other's pockets for months now, but it never felt crowded. Instead, it felt natural, like they'd been meant to orbit each other all along. "I've been thinking," she said eventually, "about what you said in Casper, about school and training. And? And I think I'd like to learn. Not to leave, but to bring something back. There's a correspondence program Mrs. Kowalski told me about, teaching certificates through the mail. I could study here, take exams when we go into town. Maybe eventually teach some of the ranch children in the area who can't get to regular school." Elias lifted his head to look at her properly. "You'd be good at that. You're patient, and you understand what it's like to struggle." "You think so?" "I know so." He hesitated, then said, "There's something I've been thinking about too, something I wanted to ask you, but I don't want you to feel pressured." Her heart started beating faster. "What is it?" "We're building a life here together, building a home. And I know we haven't known each other that long, just a few months, really, but I can't imagine doing any of this without you. Can't imagine coming back here alone or waking up alone or any of it. You've become—" He struggled for words. "Essential. You've become essential to my life, Rosalie." She was crying now, but smiling through the tears. "You've become essential to mine too. So I'm asking, and you can say no. You can take time to think about it. You can tell me it's too soon, but I'm asking if you'd consider making this permanent. Not just living here together, but actually building a life together. As partners in everything, as—" He took a breath. "As my wife." The word hung in the air between them, enormous and terrifying and perfect. "Yes," Rosalie said, not hesitating. "Yes, I'll marry you." Elias's expression transformed, joy breaking through the careful control he usually maintained. He pulled her close, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, finally her lips, gentle and sure and full of promise. "I don't have a ring," he said when they finally pulled apart. "Didn't think that far ahead. I can get one when we go to town next." "I don't need a ring. I just need you." "You'll have both. You'll have everything I can give you." They sat under Mary's oak tree as darkness fell, making plans and dreaming aloud about their future. They'd get married in the fall, Elias said, after harvest season when they could take time for a proper celebration. They'd invite Mrs. Kowalski and Chen and Marshall Thornton, the people who'd helped them survive. They'd plant more trees, maybe buy some cattle again, build slowly and carefully towards something sustainable. "I want children someday," Rosalie said tentatively. "Is that something you'd want?" Elias was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'd be terrified. Terrified I'd fail them the way I failed Mary, the way I'd fail anyone I was responsible for protecting. But with you, I think I could be brave enough to try. You make me brave, Rosalie. You were always brave, you just forgot for a while. Maybe. Or maybe I just needed someone worth being brave for." Tom and Samuel finished their work a week later and headed back to Casper with full pay and Elias's gratitude. The cabin stood complete, solid and beautiful, ready for the life that would unfold within its walls. Rosalie spent the last day before they officially moved in, making it a home. She hung curtains she'd sewn from fabric bought in Casper, arranged furniture they'd purchased from various settlers who were moving on, put her few possessions in the bedroom alongside Elias's. She filled the kitchen with supplies, organized the storage room, even put wildflowers in a jar on the table. That evening, Elias carried her across the threshold in a gesture that was both romantic and practical. There was still sawdust everywhere, and he didn't want her tracking it through the clean spaces. "Welcome home, Mrs. Cutter," he said, though they weren't married yet. "Not Mrs. Cutter for another few months." "Practice," he said with a grin, setting her down gently. They spent their first night in the new cabin sitting on the porch they'd built together, watching stars emerge in a sky so vast it hurt to comprehend. The land stretched out before them, their land now, paid for with survival and stubbornness and the decision to keep choosing each other every single day. "Do you ever think about how close we came to never meeting?" Rosalie asked. "If my father had left me somewhere else, if you'd slept through my screaming, if any of 100 small things had been different. I try not to. Thinking about the paths not taken will drive you mad. But we got so lucky." "No." Elias took her hand. "Luck is random. This was choice. I chose to investigate that scream instead of ignoring it. You chose to trust me when you had every reason not to. We chose each other, again and again, through every hard thing that came after. That's not luck. That's love." The words settled over them, finally spoken aloud after months of dancing around it. Love. Simple and complicated, fragile and unbreakable. The thing that had pulled them through hell and brought them home. "I love you," Rosalie said, testing the words, finding them true. "I love you," Elias Cutter. "I love you too. Have since the moment you told Martha Winters your name and refused to let her make you small. Maybe even before that." They kissed under the vast Wyoming sky. Two people who'd been broken finding wholeness in each other. Two people who'd been alone discovering that together was better than any solitude. Summer passed in a blur of work and slowly building routine. Rosalie started her correspondence courses, studying by lamplight after the day's work was done. Elias bought 6 head of cattle and started rebuilding his herd. They rode into Lark Hollow occasionally for supplies, and though some people still whispered, others had softened. Frank McKenna always greeted them warmly. Even Mrs. Winters, upon hearing of their engagement, offered a grudging nod that might have been approval, or might have been acknowledgement that she'd been wrong. The Morrison twins tried to start trouble once, drunk and belligerent outside the general store. But Elias didn't rise to it, just calmly asked if they wanted to explain to Marshal Thornton why they were harassing witnesses in a federal case. The twins left without further incident, and word spread quickly. The Cutter place was off limits, protected not just by Elias's reputation, but by the weight of federal law. Fall arrived with a riot of color, aspens turning gold against the green of pine, the air crisp and smelling of harvest. Rosalie's garden produced more than they could eat, so she preserved what she could and shared the rest with neighbors who were slowly becoming friends. The isolation she'd feared never materialized. There was always too much to do, too much to learn, too much joy in the simple act of building a life to feel lonely. On a perfect October day when the sky was so blue it hurt to look at, they got married under Mary's oak tree. Mrs. Kowalski traveled from Casper with a cake she'd baked. District Attorney Chen came with his wife. Marshal Thornton officiated, having gotten ordained specifically for the occasion. A handful of neighbors attended. Frank McKenna, the Morrison parents who apologized for their sons, even a few ranch families from the area who'd heard the story and wanted to show support. Rosalie wore a dress of pale yellow that she'd made herself, simple but beautiful. Elias wore his best clothes, scrubbed and nervous and more handsome than she'd ever seen him. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promising not just love but partnership, not just commitment but freedom, not just support but growth. "I promise to see you," Elias said, his voice carrying clearly. "Not as property, not as responsibility, but as the remarkable woman you are and the even more remarkable woman you're becoming. I promise to stand with you, not in front of you, to lift you up when you fall and to let you lift me, to choose you every day for the rest of my life." Rosalie's vows were simpler. "I promise to stay, not because I'm trapped or obligated or have nowhere else to go, but because here, with you, is where I want to be. I promise to build with you, to dream with you, to face whatever comes with you. I promise to love you not just for saving me, but for teaching me how to save myself." Marshal Thornton pronounced them married, and they kissed to cheers and applause from their small gathering of friends. Mrs. Kowalski cried into her handkerchief. Chen's wife dabbed at her eyes. Even Frank McKenna looked suspiciously misty. The celebration lasted into the evening, food and music and dancing on the new porch. Someone had brought a fiddle, and the music drifted across the rangeland, a sound of joy where there had been so much sorrow. As the party wound down and guests began departing, promising to visit again soon, Elias and Rosalie stood at the edge of their property watching the sun set. Orange and red painted the sky, the mountains going purple in the distance. "Happy?" Elias asked. "So happy I'm afraid I'll wake up and find it was all a dream." "Not a dream, real, all of it real." She leaned into him, his arm coming around her shoulders automatically. "What do you think our life will look like? In 5 years, 10 years? I think we'll still be here, on this land. I think the cabin might have an addition or two, maybe for the children we talked about. I think your garden will be twice as big and my herd will have grown. I think we'll have faced hard winters and droughts and all the struggles that come with this life. But I think we'll have faced them together, and that will have made us stronger. I think you're right. Rosalie looked up at him. I think we'll look back at this day, at this moment, and remember it as the beginning of the best part of our lives. It already is. They stood watching until full dark fell, then walked hand in hand back to their cabin. Their home, built from ashes and determination, filled now with love and possibility. Inside, the lamps glowed warm and welcoming. The fire crackled in the hearth. The bedroom waited, prepared for their wedding night with fresh linens and the promise of a future they'd create together. Rosalie Turner Cutter closed the door on the past and turned to face her husband, her partner, her choice. Outside, the Wyoming night settled over the land with its familiar sounds: wind through sage, distant coyotes singing, the creek running cold and clear. Inside, two people who'd found each other against impossible odds began the next chapter of their story. It wouldn't be easy. Life never was. There would be hard times, cattle losses, crop failures, long winters when supplies ran low and tempers ran high. There would be disagreements and doubts, and moments when they questioned everything. But there would also be spring mornings with coffee on the porch, summer evenings working side by side, fall harvests that filled their pantry, winter nights when the world narrowed to nothing but the warmth between them. There would be children eventually, 2 daughters and a son, each taught that they mattered, that their voices counted, that they were never less than fully human. They'd grow up knowing their mother's story, understanding the strength it took to survive and the courage it took to build something new from rubble. There would be decades of partnership, of slowly growing old together, of becoming the kind of couple younger people looked at and hoped to emulate. They'd weather everything life threw at them because they'd learned early that surviving together was better than surviving alone. And when Elias finally died at 83, having lived a long and full life on the land he loved, Rosalie would bury him under Mary's oak tree beside his sister's ashes. She'd sit there in her grief and remember the morning he'd cut her down from the fence, the way he'd looked at her and said, "You're not livestock, not while I'm breathing." She'd remember how he'd kept that promise for 52 years, how he'd seen her and valued her and loved her every single day. She'd remember building their life together from nothing, creating something beautiful and lasting from trauma and pain. And she'd understand, finally and fully, that being saved and learning to save yourself weren't opposite things. They were 2 parts of the same story, the story of becoming whole. But that was decades away. Tonight was just the beginning. Tonight, Elias Cutter and Rosalie Turner Cutter stood in their bedroom, looking at each other with wonder and joy, and the profound recognition that they'd found something precious, not perfection, but partnership, not rescue, but mutual redemption, not ownership, but freely chosen love. "Ready?" Elias asked softly. "For what?" "For everything. For the life we're going to build. For all of it." Rosalie smiled, took his hand, and stepped into their future without fear. "Ready," she said. And she was. The ashes of her past had finally stopped burning, leaving only fertile ground where new things could grow. She'd been abandoned, abused, left to die on a frozen fence line by a man who should have loved her. But she'd survived. More than survived. She'd found herself, found her strength, found someone who saw her worth when she'd forgotten it existed. The lonely cowboy and the girl he'd saved had become something neither expected: equals, partners, soulmates. They'd taken their broken pieces and forged something unbreakable. They'd looked at a burned cabin and seen possibility. They'd faced down evil men and won not through violence but through the simple act of refusing to surrender. They'd chosen each other. They'd chosen life. They'd chosen hope. And under the vast Wyoming sky, in a cabin built from determination and love, they began their forever. Not perfect, not easy, but wholly, completely, beautifully theirs. The end of their trauma was the beginning of their peace. The end of running was the beginning of home. The end of alone was the beginning of together. And that, finally, was enough.